This is Channel 4, and now sign on with a Newswatch special.
One morning, some soldiers arrived in a truck. They told everyone they were going to be taken away. They cried and begged to stay, but they were forced to go. Everyone from the villages had to go. They all got in the van, huddled together, and they were driven off. It was dreadful, frightening.
That was Julesma, one of hundreds of thousands of refugees affected by the fighting in what used to be Yugoslavia. She's a hearing person, but we were able to interview her in sign language for this special hour-long edition of Sign On Newswatch. Later in the programme, we'll find out why she learned to sign.
In Europe and around the world, there are tens of millions of refugees looking for safety in other countries. They are part of our look back at 1992 and ahead to 1993. We'll be updating some of the stories we covered in 1992 and looking at some of special interest to deaf people, which escaped us and most of the news programmes, such as the address by a deaf person to the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Mr. President, distinguished General Assembly delegates, on behalf of deaf people around the world, I wish to express our deepest gratitude to the United Nations for this opportunity to present a glimpse of our world view here in the General Assembly.
Who was that? If you want to know, keep watching.
One part of the world we didn't look at in 1992 was the Indian subcontinent. But in December, events there forced their way onto our news screens. In the northern Indian town of Ayodhya, a mob of zealots of the Hindu religion tore down an ancient Muslim mosque. That was on Sunday the 6th of December. Within hours, Muslims throughout India reacted with their own violence, as News at 10 reported on Monday the 7th.
Across India today, the Muslim backlash began. In more than 50 cities and towns, there was protest, rioting and deaths. Muslim fought Hindu in clashes provoked by yesterday's destruction of the Ayodhya mosque. Riot police were on the streets as Muslim gangs pledged vengeance, seeking any Hindu targets they could. In these clashes in the capital Delhi, 3 people were killed. Elsewhere, hundreds more casualties. Many areas came under curfew tonight as thousands of police took up positions guarding mosques and temples. The army is standing by. In Ayodhya today, police finally moved to take control. Hindu fanatics were leaving, having achieved their objective to destroy the 16th century mosque built, they claim, on the site of the birthplace of their god Ram. For India's 120 million Muslims, the destruction of the mosque is a grievous insult. The action of the Hindu fanatics has thrown the government into political crisis and the country into turmoil. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was shouted down in Parliament with calls for his resignation. But he survived so far with a promise to outlaw extreme communal groups and to rebuild the mosque in Ayodhya.
You know, it's easy to cause a riot in India, but very difficult to contain it. So the next few days are going to be very crucial, and we will know at the end of maybe 3-4 days what it's going to look like.
Here in the capital tonight, the streets are deserted, some areas under curfew. The atmosphere here and in many other parts of the country is one of fear and tension. Age-old communal and religious hatreds have been rekindled. provoked by what observers here are calling an explosion of madness. Having failed to prevent it, the task for the government is to stop the violence spreading.
Over the following days, hundreds of people were killed in fighting in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, where there are mixed Hindu and Muslim populations. And Muslims all over the world were outraged. Here in Britain, there were attacks on some Hindu temples.
They may be thousands of miles away from the violence in India, but for the Hindu community in Birmingham, that violence spilled over into their lives today. Tonight they mourn the loss of their temple, destroyed by fire. For a while at least, a school hall will serve as their makeshift place of prayer. The Sri Krishna Temple in West Bromwich was the worst hit by the arson attacks. The others, also in the West Midlands and Greater Manchester, are all thought to have been started deliberately.
We don't like this situation to spread.
How worried are you about
Very. We are the very peaceful community, especially Gujarati community in this borough. And we never had this sort of problem before.
Community leaders have condemned the attacks, blaming them on extremists. At a number of hastily arranged meetings around the country between police and Asian leaders, all sides called for calm.
In my opinion, they shouldn't take this law into their own hand. And if they carry on, it will be very bad for the whole of the Muslim community in the world.
That's a view shared by many young Muslims in Birmingham.
Unless I was there, then I could do something about it, but you live in this country, you have to live by the laws.
It hurts a lot when you hear about it. I don't think so. Anybody's got any right to go into anybody's place and knock you down, whether it's church or temple or a mosque.
The attacks are being seen as isolated incidents, but no one's taking any chances. The police in the West Midlands have been told to keep a closer eye on temples and mosques.
After these events, we received a letter from Rita Mystery, a young Asian woman from Coventry who's deaf. This is what she said. On the 10th of December to the 12th of December, I saw on the news about India. At the moment in India, there's fighting with Muslims and Hindus. I don't understand why they fight, but I hope it will come on Newswatch. Sign on. Would you explain what is happening? Here in the studio, we have Shalil Ladd, who is a Hindu,
Hello.
and Yunus Lorgat, who is a Muslim.
Hello.
Welcome to the programme. What are your feelings about the disturbances in India? Yunus?
When it first erupted, I was very shocked. It was terrible to see such violence in India. Many Asian people have died in the clashes. I'm wishing and hoping for a peaceful solution.
Shalil?
Well, I felt very sorry for the people in India with the fighting. I've got family over there. It's different to Britain. Here, everyone is very friendly. Coloured and Asian people socialise and mix, regardless of religion. Take the deaf community. People are deaf first. Religion doesn't matter. I think the deaf world's got it right.
You say you and your friends come from all creeds. Do you get access to information about what's happening in India?
To be honest, only a little. I've had some of the Muslim ways explained to me by some Muslims that I know, but obviously they're not very experienced in the ways themselves. Likewise, my Hindu friends aren't very experienced, but we do exchange information, try to learn each other's cultures, and we never mock each other. So it's very positive.
Yunus?
Well, I don't know what's happening with the disturbances. It's not accessible.
So if you're not getting access to that information, how would you like to see that improved? What demands would you make?
I want more Asian deaf people to be told about the violence, why it's happening and the reasons behind it. And I'd like to see more interpreted or subtitled news.
Shalil?
Well, 2 points. Firstly, there should be more Asian deaf communities established in Britain, like the one in Leicester. In the Leicester Asian community, we get information about what's happening in India because some of the men and women read Asian languages, so they can tell us what's happening. Others perhaps don't have the access. Their parents don't tell them, and that's not good enough. So we must be involved in the wider Asian community. Secondly, we must involve interpreters in the Network East programme, where hearing people talk about Asia. We must get sign language interpreters involved there. They have deaf viewers too.
Thank you both for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. It's not only in Asia, or between Asian communities, of course, that there are frictions. As economic depression settles over Europe, nowhere is free from tension. In Eastern Europe especially, with the collapse of communist governments everywhere, including the Soviet Union, people are struggling to come to terms with new ways of life, in particular, the new facts of economic life. Germany has the peculiar problem of trying to fit together a wealthy capitalist economy in the West with the struggling, underdeveloped eastern part of the country, the 17 million citizens of the former East Germany. 60 years ago, there were one people. Then war and the division of Europe which followed cut their country in two. Now, after nearly 50 years apart, they're trying to learn to live together again, and not finding it as easy as they'd hoped. As this report, by Peter Sharp for News at 10, showed.
Nothing unites the Germans like a beer and a band. A nostalgic night out at the Bauhaus in old East Berlin, a little sparkle, a little Strauss for East German factory workers still struggling to adjust to the trauma of unification. Next morning in the factory canteen, and here their fears are more easily assessed. The euphoria that followed the collapse of the wall replaced today with gloom and uncertainty. Marrying Marx to the market economy has decimated the East German workforce.
A lot of people have absolutely no future. Whole sections of industry are disappearing. People are afraid.
And that fear has manifested itself on the streets of Rostock and spread to other German cities. The continuing rise of the right wing. Neo-Nazis attacking the hostels of the asylum seekers and immigrant workers whom they say threaten their jobs. In the last 12 months, more than 500,000 people streamed into Germany, taking advantage of its liberal asylum laws and adding a further £3.25 billion to the cost of unification. European fears of the economic and political strength of a reunited Germany are regarded as laughable by East Germans. 40 years of communism had left its citizens totally unprepared for the realities of life in the West.
The politicians and the trade unions didn't tell the laborers that having such fast wage increases would mean high unemployment. I mean, the East Germans simply were never used to unemployment. They didn't know that this thing could happen.
And these are the economic monuments to unification. Outdated machinery, operated by an overstaffed, uncompetitive workforce. Almost overnight, a third of the people, that's 3 million workers, found their factories gone along with their jobs. When this cable company was taken over by a British corporation 9 months ago, there were nearly 6,000 people employed here. 4,000 will lose their jobs as new computer technology streamlines the factory floor. But British investment has saved the plant. For people like Werner Bissart, recently appointed plant manager, this transition has been painful. Werner and his wife Regina are both 30-something, and the closest thing you'll find to East German yuppies. Materially, their lives have improved, but he agonizes over the men he'll now have to make redundant.
I'm 23 years in the factory, on this place, and most of them I know for a very long time. So, and for myself, it's very hard to make such kind of decision.
Affluent West Germans are angry that the cost of reunification has meant higher prices, higher taxes, and high interest rates. A monetary policy that has in turn kept European rates up, precipitating last month's sterling crisis. The Keisling family from West Berlin always believed in a united Germany, even if that meant higher taxes. But the problems go deeper than that.
We suddenly found that they are different to us. You can't say they are German and we are German and now we are all German. No, we have to come closer, and these are very small steps and not big steps. The big one was to reunite, and now we have to do the work.
At the Brandenburg Gate, which once symbolized the division between the two Germanys, They're selling the cast-offs from a former army of occupation. But today the threat to a united Germany comes not from its neighbours on the east or west, but from within. Given time, Germany can sort out its economic problems. What's going to take much longer are the psychological problems of unification. The wall that exists in the minds of the people continues to separate east from west.
But the divisions between East and West Germans seem mild compared to the hostility we saw earlier from right-wing racists towards immigrants and refugees. That was in October. A month later, the German National Front Party, a neo-Nazi organisation, was banned after the murder of 3 Turkish women living in Germany. But since then, the German government has also reacted by tightening up its laws, making it more difficult for refugees to enter.
One country where these racial tensions involve not immigrants but different native groups is the former Yugoslavia, now divided into 6 republics. The biggest of these, Serbia, has so far clashed with most of the others to a greater or lesser degree. The situation is complex because there is no neat division of republics between peoples. So, Serbs living in Croatia, for example, have taken possession of parts of the country in the name of Serbia. A United Nations peacekeeping force is still in Croatia, trying to keep the 2 sides from fighting.
In some republics, the divisions are complicated not only by nationality, but by religious and ethnic divisions. In Bosnia, 17% of the population are Croats, who are Roman Catholic. 32% Serbs, who are Orthodox Christians. And 44% are Muslims. But the Serbs, though smaller in numbers, are supported by the neighbouring Republic of Serbia. They have been accused of trying to get rid of all the Muslims in a process known as ethnic cleansing. Whether or not this is true, hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been forced to leave their homes.
There are 600,000 refugees in the Republic of Croatia. Germany has accepted 200,000. Austria and Hungary, 50,000. Sweden, nearly 50,000. But Britain has been much tighter. The government said it would accept only 1,300. Humanitarian organisations in Britain have objected to this strict policy. A number of volunteer groups set up their own initiatives to try and bring some of the suffering refugees over here. We went to look at one such venture based in the north of England, and we managed to obtain a rather special interview. This is Baydale Lodge, a former old people's home in Darlington, owned by Durham County Council. It was closed down in early 1992, but then reopened in October for some very special guests, a coachload of refugees from Bosnia, brought here by a volunteer group of local people. Here at the refugee centre, we met one Bosnian woman who has a deaf brother in Sarajevo. This is what she told us.
Two hearing people stopped me in the street and they asked me if I was a Muslim. I said I was, and they said that Muslims had to go. I said why, but they didn't answer. They move into the nice houses that are left, but the horrible houses, they just set on fire. My own grown-up daughter was with me and the others down in the cellar. The soldiers came, opened the door, and threatened to blow us all up if we didn't come out. They took us all out and pushed us into a wheat field. And then they just gunned people down. I saw it. It was horrible. I saw one old woman with her back slit right open. I got to my feet and I saw a soldier grab hold of my daughter's hair. He was going to slit her throat. I cried and begged him. I had to kiss his hand and said she was my only daughter. I begged him to let her go. He did. Then he picked on an old man with a moustache and no teeth. He put the gun to his head and shot him. He just keeled over. It was horrible. There were bodies everywhere. Old people were taken away, pleading to be put into prison. I was terrified in the truck. A soldier threatened me with a bayonet, demanded my jewellery, rings, anything valuable. He kept threatening me. I gave him my earrings. I'd hidden my necklace. I'd sewn it into my waistband here so they didn't spot it. And I brought it with me here. I arrived in Britain with nothing except a little money. That's all.
Could you tell us what your deaf brother is doing there?
During the fighting, he hid in a cellar and kept quiet. There was nothing to eat, so he had to cut nettles and boil them for food.
How did deaf people in Bosnia find out about the war and how to get away? By television and newspapers?
My brother reads newspapers. He can understand them. But the television he can't hear, so he doesn't understand it. But he watches it. He has lots of newspapers. He would ask someone who could hear the television to tell him what was going on. But now all these things like the television have gone. That's it.
Do you know what's happening to your deaf brother?
It's 9 months since I saw him or heard anything of him. I like it here, but I can't sleep. I keep thinking about Bosnia and seeing all the killings, people being mowed down, all the dead bodies. It was horrendous. Even the old women being rounded up and imprisoned. I'll never, ever go back to Bosnia. Never. I want to stay here.
Dulesma, just one of millions of refugees who see Britain and Western Europe as safe havens from a life of terror. In 1991 alone, more than 525,000 people sought asylum in Western Europe. Last year, it was even more. Tessa, that was amazing, to find somebody you could communicate so well with in sign language. How did you discover that Dulesma could sign?
When we arrived to film, we attempted to communicate with some of the refugees and didn't do too badly. For the interviews, we were going to use an interpreter, But this person came up to us and started to sign. She could communicate quite well, and at first we thought she was confident at gesturing because she was a foreigner. When the interpreter did arrive, she was able to tell us that she had a deaf brother. So we thought, right, we'll interview her directly, face to face.
How did her story affect you?
Well, it's interesting, actually. When she was telling me her story, I felt very moved, and I was actually moved to tears. Obviously, I was horrified by the reports on television and in the press and felt very strongly for the victims. But when a person actually tells you of their experiences, the emotional reaction is quite different. It's interesting.
She's a hearing person and you're deaf, and you both sign quite differently. How did you manage to understand each other?
It's funny. She's hearing and I'm deaf. She doesn't know any English and I certainly don't know her language. But we were able to understand each other by using clear gesture-based signs like baby, drink, food, frightened. You might have thought she meant cold, but the facial expressions showed that she meant fear. It was strange because when we questioned the centre organiser, she told us that the biggest problem they have when the refugees arrive is communication. They have to bring in interpreters every day. But when we, as deaf people, arrived, we were able to get through straight away. We didn't need interpreters.
So you could both understand each other because of sign language. Coming up next, we'll be updating some of the major stories we covered in 1992. Looking ahead to the prospects for deaf viewers in the ITV regions under the new franchises. And finding out who that deaf person was who addressed the United Nations. Join us after the break.
At the Texas sale now, just $79.95 buys you this stylish Chiswick wardrobe, and this chest of drawers, and this bedside cabinet, and the bed. There's even a choice of colors. Don't miss out. Go one better at the Texas sale.
It's no good, Ned. You're surrounded. You might as well come on out. I'm giving you a count of 3. 1, 2.
Righto. Nobody move or I eat the Weetabix.
Back, men. He's not bluffing.
Right, that's it.
Have you had your Weetabix?
If your indigestion tablets taste chalky and gritty, try Remigel. They're soft, chewy and minty. Remigel. They're chewy, not chalky.
Welcome back. 1992 was our first year of Sign On Newswatch. With a monthly programme, it was impossible to follow everything that was going on in an incredibly eventful year. But here's an update on just some of the stories we covered.
British politics, of course, featured strongly in many of our programmes. In April, we saw John Major lead the Conservative Party to a general election victory. Then, within 6 months, find himself in deep trouble over a number of issues, including pit closures, the worsening economic recession, the withdrawal of the pound from the European exchange rate mechanism, and the argument over the Maastricht Treaty on greater European integration. But in December, he seemed to have finished Britain's 6 months presidency of the European Community with a limited success at the Edinburgh Summit. As the Sunday Times put it,
Major wins Euro deal. At a price.
Last June, the Danish people rejected the Maastricht Treaty. The deal was a settlement that will allow the Danes to call a second referendum next spring. The price was an increase in the EC budget, which means that Britain will be paying more to help the community's poorer countries.
In the words of the Queen herself, 1992 was a horrible year for the royal family. And just 4 days after we examined the troubled monarchy last month, on December the 9th, it was announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales were to separate. An event which completely overshadowed the wedding of the divorced Princess Anne, the Princess Royal. The separation received the kind of attention which we've come to expect from the tabloid press. The Daily Express and the Daily Mail continued to echo each other in the uncanny way they seem to have been doing quite regularly on this issue. See if you can spot the difference. The Daily Express.
End of the fairy tale.
And the Daily Mail?
End of the fairy tale.
Well, did you spot the difference? Yes, it was the same headline. Yes, it was the same picture of the Princess of Wales. But look closely at the photographs of the Prince. Yes, in a triumph of archive research, the picture libraries of the Mail and the Express did manage to find different photographs of the Prince of Wales. And amidst all the serious talk about the implications for the monarchy, not to mention the UK Constitution, some newspapers continued to treat it all like an episode of Palace. The Sunday Mirror.
Di's plot to make Wills king. Princess Diana is plotting for Prince William to be the next king instead of Prince Charles, royal sources revealed last night. The simmering hostility between the couple has become a poisonous power struggle, with the monarchy as the prize. Di is determined to be queen, but if it is not possible, she will do anything she can to stop Charles becoming king. She wants him to renounce the succession and stand aside for Wills, making her the power behind the throne, and her victory over the House of Windsor complete.
For 1,000 years, the British monarchy has survived through civil war, the execution of King Charles I, the madness of George III, and many periods of deep unpopularity. Can it survive superstardom? That's one of the questions for 1993.
Last June, at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, 150 countries signed an agreement on how to sustain development without destroying the environment. We reported on that, and in 1993 we'll be keeping an eye on how governments intend to honour the pledges they made. It may not get the attention of some more sensational news items, but in the long run, the health of our planet is the biggest issue we all have to face.
In April and May, America's black people were literally up in arms at the acquittal of 4 police officers who had beaten a black man. The riots that followed highlighted just one of the many challenges facing the new US President, Bill Clinton, who takes up office on the 20th of January. Another challenge on the international front is how to use America's military power wisely in a troubled world. President Clinton will inherit situations such as the presence of 28,000 US troops in Somalia, the East African country where they began to land on December the 9th.
American Navy Special Forces landed in Mogadishu half an hour ago. They went ashore on the Somali capital's beach just before dawn Witnesses said the men arrived in Navy kayaks and canoes. These men are elite forces, specially trained to hold the beaches till the Marines' landing craft start arriving in a few hours' time. Some of the men had blackened faces, camouflage made slightly redundant by the presence of American television crews waiting on the beach. The men had personal weapons and a heavy machine gun. Somali gunmen had been warned to stay well clear.
The troops were sent in to stop warring factions and clans from fighting and preventing relief supplies from getting to hundreds of thousands of starving people. The idea is that the US will hand over to United Nations peacekeeping forces as soon as possible. But with memories of Vietnam and other places where American troops have been drawn into regional conflicts, American soldiers have been killed, and US public opinion has turned hostile, Clinton will have to tread warily.
And now to the question we asked at the start of the programme. Who was the deaf man we saw addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations? Well, that was Jyrki Andersson, President of the World Federation of the Deaf. On the 12th of October, he was one of a number of representatives of disability organisations who addressed the General Assembly's special meeting marking the conclusion of the Decade of Disabled Persons. The aim of the United Nations Programme for the Disabled is to ensure the full participation and equality of disabled people in society. But, like other speakers, Jyrki Andersson warned that after a decade of concentrating on this issue, there was still a long way to go.
Two years ago, the General Secretariat published an important document on the human rights of deaf people in developing countries, with copies sent to all the UN agencies. But our greatest concern is the deaf people in developing countries. Between 80 and 90% of all deaf children in these countries still have no access to education. Volunteers in the United States and a few other countries have established educational programs for deaf children in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And national federations of the deaf in Nordic countries have recently received government grants to send their deaf experts to selected developing countries to assist deaf adults in establishing organizations and managing their own adult education programs. This new alternative has been found to be very promising. Deaf experts and volunteers in other industrialized countries are ready to follow the Nordic example, but these governments are not yet ready to accept such a radical alternative. Another concern the WFD shares with the World Blind Union and the International Federation of the Hard of Hearing, the International League of Societies for Persons with Mental Handicap, and Disabled Persons International, is that the World Program of Action concerning disabled persons and the recommendations at the UN-sponsored meetings in Stockholm and Järvenpää have not been fully implemented in every country. Furthermore, the program has failed to notice that deaf persons cannot reach equality and will not be able to develop full participation in society unless certain conditions are met. This is why the WFD now requests the United Nations to include in future documents, such as the standard rules on the equalization of opportunities for disabled persons and the long-term strategy towards a society for all, the following measures which can provide barrier-free environments for deaf persons. First, access to education given in the natural language of deaf persons, that is, sign language. Second, access to sign language interpreting services in all countries. And third, access to mass media, including television programs in sign language.
It may not have hit the headlines, but for us, one of the highlights of 1992 was seeing the needs of deaf people being put to the UN General Assembly in sign language.
Now, from the international back to the local. Jurke Andersen referred in his statement to the need for television programmes in sign language. And this is an appropriate time to look at provision here in the UK. Yesterday was the first day of the new ITV franchises. The companies that will supply independent television programmes into the 21st century began their new or, in most cases, continued their old service. By 1998, at least 50% of their programmes must, by law, be subtitled, and it's reckoned that they'll not only meet their target, but far exceed it. But what about sign language? There's no absolute requirement under the new Broadcasting Act to provide anything in sign language, even in news and current affairs. So are we likely to be much better catered for in that respect than in the old franchise period from 1982 to 1992? Here, with a look back and a look forward at signed news and current affairs in the ITV regions, is Rachel Bastikar. This is Studio 2 at Tyne Tees Television in Newcastle, one of the 15 regional ITV companies. Every week, studios like this all around the country produce hours and hours of programmes about the events that touch everybody's lives. But how much of this is accessible to deaf people through sign language? Tyne Tees is one of the 12 ITV companies that kept its franchise. Like a number of others, during its previous franchise, it started to provide signed access to regional news. Here are some examples of what different companies provided.
Hello and welcome to our look back at events in the news over the past week. Today, the school in Dorset, where the pupils are also the local fire brigade,
Now a look at the week's headlines signed for the deaf by Noreen Williams. On Saturday, a man was remanded by Workington magistrates on charges of conspiring to supply controlled drugs.
The Prime Minister, John Major, says the Home Rule policies for Scotland of Labour and the Liberal Democrats put the existence of the United Kingdom in danger.
3 bombs have exploded in Belfast, 2 in a Chichester Street shopping centre and 1 in an Ormo Road shop. No one has been hurt.
Fire brigades throughout Wales are stepping up their Christmas safety campaigns after a family of 3 died in a house blaze at Merthyr earlier today.
The last 2 examples came from Ulster and HTV Wales, the first 2 companies to employ deaf people to sign their news headlines. Up until last October, Tyne Tees also featured signed headlines at the end of its evening magazine. As with other companies, these were very short. Sometimes they had to be dropped if the programme was overrunning, and there were criticisms from many deaf people that the signers were neither deaf nor registered interpreters. So, in place of these headlines, Tyne Tees launched a weekly news bulletin on Friday lunchtimes. The presenter is deaf.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Newsweek. There's delight on Tyneside but disappointment on Teesside after car makers Nissan decide to switch their export-import operation from Teesport to a new custom-built terminal at Jarrow.
As an example of what dialogue between the deaf community and TV companies can achieve, this slot is likely to change yet again in the new year. There have been criticisms that Friday lunchtime is no good for many deaf people, so the bulletin will almost certainly be moved to a better time, at the weekend. Tyne Tees also produces a monthly review of the news, with 2 registered interpreters giving access. HTV West has had a half-hour weekly news review on and off for the past 4 years, But this half-hour format was pioneered by TSW, the station for South West England, which has now lost its franchise. Here's an example of what it provided for 10 years in the South West Week.
Again, and in this week's programme we meet a young deaf man from North Devon who's caught up in a communication irony. And we look at a new incentive to encourage youngsters to keep fit, which is more than can be said for Peter.
Oh.
TSW has been replaced by West Country Television, which says it will continue the weekly half-hour signed and subtitled news update. So far, all of the companies we've featured have been small or medium-sized. One of the most noticeable things under the old franchise was that none of the 6 biggest companies, which cover over 2/3 of the population, provided any regular sign language access on ITV. But we're happy to report that from April, Central TV will transmit a signed and subtitled weekly news review every Sunday. Let's hope the other major companies follow suit. In the meantime, if you want to know the plans for the future in any of these regions, these are the companies to contact. On another positive note, Grampian Television in the north of Scotland, which did a number of programmes for deaf people in the 1980s, tells us they will be providing a 5-minute signed news review in the very near future. And good news for those who like an early breakfast on Sundays. A very early breakfast. Or who remember to set their video recorders. GMTV, who are taking over the breakfast franchise from TVAM, will transmit a summary of their week's programmes with a signer and subtitles on Sunday mornings between 6 and 6:30. It will be called Time Shift. An appropriate title for a signed programme, isn't it? If you're deaf, it sometimes feels as if you have to work shifts if you want to catch up with the news. So, at a regional level, there's been a fair bit of progress. But what about a national signed news service? How soon will we catch up with the Irish, for example? Last September, during their Deaf Awareness Week, RTE, the national TV channel, started a nightly signed news bulletin at the end of their early evening news programme. This is what Irish deaf viewers saw at 6:55 on Tuesday, the 8th of December.
The Labour Party and Democratic Left have reached broad agreement on policies, but Fine Gael's deputy leader has again ruled out the idea of Dick Spring being Taoiseach or of Fine Gael being part of a government which includes Democratic Left.
It may only last 2.5 to 3 minutes, but it's 2.5 to 3 minutes more than we get on any national news in this country. It's in peak viewing time, and it's signed by a deaf person. Who says Ireland is one of the less developed countries in the European community?
We contacted the BBC, ITV and Channel 4. We pointed out that RTE has a signed bulletin in peak viewing time, and we asked, do you think we'll see a similar service for deaf people in the UK? And if so, have you any idea when this would come about? A BBC spokesperson said,
"There are currently no plans for signing news programmes. We've carefully considered the various methods of making TV news more accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing. Our resources are limited, and it's important that we reach the maximum number of people. About 50,000 people in the United Kingdom have sign language as their first language, whereas subtitling reaches a potential audience of millions. We've put considerable resources into making our news subtitling service as full and accurate as possible.
From ITV, we received this statement from Director of Programme Planning Secretariat, Paul Bonner.
ITV is conscious that signing reaches some members of the deaf community who don't benefit from subtitles. Some ITV regional companies have taken a lead in serving this need with signed local news headlines. The national news, however, is increasingly subject to pressure from competitive scheduling by other broadcasters and cannot, therefore, serve the minority in this way, though it will, of course, continue to be subtitled.
And from Channel 4, who actually dropped their only signed news bulletin, the one at 9 o'clock in the morning last September, the senior commissioning editor, News and Current Affairs, David Lloyd, said,
I do not think that a short news bulletin after the nightly Channel 4 news would work for the audience in general. For the foreseeable future, I regret to say that I do not envisage the provision of such a service.
So, for the foreseeable future, we regret to say that if you want a signed version of the national news, it looks as if you'll have to wait for the next sign-on Newswatch, and that, I'm afraid, won't be until April.
We hope you've enjoyed our review of 1992 and our look ahead to some of what the future has in store. As Paul said, Sign On will be back in the spring with a new series, keeping you informed about some of the key events in the deaf world and around the world. Till then, a happy 1993 to all our deaf and hearing viewers. Goodbye.